Philippa, take it away. Thank you.
Thanks, David. I'm going to start by. You have to allow me to share the screen because I've rejoined. So.
Oh yes, I have to make you a co-host again, don't I? Hang on. Make co-host. Yes, I do. You should be able to do it now, I think.
Okay. Good. Let me know when you can see the slideshow actually proper.
Brilliant.
Okay. Well, thanks again, everybody, and especially for turning out of an evening before Christmas. So, my name is Philippa Breaks, and I work for Whale and Dolphin Conservation. I'm also an honorary lecturer at the University of Exeter, but I live in New Zealand, and I'm going to talk a little bit about animal culture, sort of generally what animal culture is, and also what it isn't too. And then, because fundamentally I'm a conservation biologist, I want to talk a bit about, what animal culture might mean for conservation as well. Excuse me. So, first of all, I think we all know what human culture is. I think most of us, we live, breathe, and eat human culture every single day. And human culture, sometimes we tend to think of culture as being sort of arts based, but actually much of the behavior that humans undertake, from whether it's tool use to migration to sharing information about architecture to our communication strategies to religion, even to marketing, is all a form of human culture. So that tends to be, when I say the word culture, that sort of tends to be the way that we think about culture is usually within the context of the human world. So what then on earth is animal culture? So I work through the Convention on Migratory Species, through their expert group on animal culture, and we've been gathering since 2014 to try to understand examples of animal culture that are relevant to the migration of wild species. And through that work, we are trying to determine, sort of getting under the bonnet really, of this question of what animal culture means for conservation of these migratory species. But in order to do that, we had to kind of settle on some definitions. And as you might imagine, there are actually lots of different definitions for culture that one could use. But we have used quite a broad-based definition, which I think is useful in the context of thinking about culture's implications for conservation. So culture is really about the social transmission of information. So that we know that we already know quite a lot about how information is transported between generations through the physical mechanism of genes. But culture is how information is spread either between generations or even within generations. So the definition that we use is that culture is informational behavior which is shared within a community, which is acquired from conspecifics through some form of social learning. So basically, that means that you learn something from others in your social group or maybe beyond your social group, and that information is then shared because others are usually copying your behavior. So really, the process that is important when it comes to considering animal culture is this process of social learning. And social learning is something that human beings do all the time. It's what we're doing right now. When we have a discussion, we're often learning from one another. So the definition of social learning that we use is any learning process that is influenced by the observation of or interaction with another animal or its products. And when we think about its products, we might be thinking about nesting sites or tool use and things like that. So this little montage of photographs shows a few different examples of where there is evidence of social learning across different species. And you can see it's quite diverse and quite widely spread across vertebrate species. And there is some evidence from invertebrate species as well. I'm probably not going to talk very much about invertebrate species because that's not really my area of expertise, but more the vertebrates is the area that I know more about. So one good example is the top right-hand photograph is quite hard to believe, but this is actually a species known as whooping cranes in the US, and the whooping cranes are quite endangered, and there's been multiple attempts to try and reintroduce them into the wild that weren't successful. And then somebody had the bright idea of utilizing the fact that birds tend to imprint on the first thing that they see, because this is a survivorship mechanism. So the idea was to dress in a crane suit, and when the birds hatch out, for the person in the crane suit to then feed the birds. And so the birds then imprint upon the human beings in the crane suit. And through that, they were then able to get in a crane suit and hop into a microlight and lead the birds successfully on their first migration. So this is kind of social learning in action, if you like, but it's actually, in this instance, of course, it's between species social learning. The human beings are actually showing the cranes where they have to migrate to and from. And the hope is, of course, in this instance, that the birds then, having taken their first migration and understanding where this particular critical habitat is, that they then go on to survive migrating successfully and rearing their own offspring and teaching them to migrate successfully in the wild. But sometimes it's not quite that simple, because you might teach the birds how to migrate, but actually teaching them how to rear their offspring is a whole different set of skills that they need to learn as well. So the other example that I want to touch on from this slide is, unsurprisingly, the whale down in the bottom right-hand corner. That is a humpback whale, which is doing something very special, which is called kick feeding. And it's special because this whale is from a population that migrates past the Stellwagen Bank. So I believe we've got somebody from Massachusetts on our Zoom meeting, and I'm sure that they will know about this example. So these whales, so humpback whales are quite well known for doing bubble net feeding, and I'm sure you would have probably seen examples of that, and that's a quite amazing cooperative behavior. They also will lunge feed into a school of fish, where they sort of dive and then open their mouth and take a mouthful of the fish. But the unusual behavior in this particular population is that the whales will lift their tail out of the water and they'll smack the surface of the water in order to slightly stun the fish, and then they usually, after slapping the surface with their tail, they'll dive down, blow a few bubbles, which obviously helps them to corral the fish, and then they'll get a mouthful of fish. What's interesting about this behavior is that this has been observed over 30 years. And someone called Jenny Allen did a really nice study on watching how the behavior was spread between individuals in the population, using a really great tool that we now have called network-based diffusion analysis, which enables you to actually chart the progress of social information across a social network, and then you can determine that the behavior is spreading because it is socially learnt, rather than it is spreading because this is an innate behavior that all animals in this species would naturally undertake, because it's kind of like forced from their environment, or there's environmental cues that are causing the behavior to take place. So those are just a few examples of what animal culture actually is. So it's this socially learned behavior. And the reason why it's interesting from a conservation perspective is that social learning generates patterning in the natural environment. And it's only really fairly recently that we've come to have the tools to recognize and be able to measure this patterning in the wild. Of course, social learning has been an evolutionary tool for, probably tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, if not more years for other species. It's only that now we're starting to be able to understand it and just sort of like be able to just get a few insights into this other layer of complexity that is occurring in the natural world, which is often referred to by many scientists as a second inheritance system. It has some of the processes of natural selection that influence the propagation of genes, influence social learning, but it's not that straightforward. There's a host of other things that can influence how social learning moves across a population. But we're just at the beginning. This is why it's an interesting area of research, I think, because we're just at the beginning of understanding some of these processes. So as a conservation biology, I'm particularly interested, there's lots of interest in how culture evolves, but for me, I'm very interested in sort of, rather than the long-term evolution of some of the more stable cultures, I'm interested in stable cultures, but I'm also interested in some of those more ephemeral behaviors that might arise, and trying to understand when sharing of social information actually enables a population to respond by behaving differently when they're under environmental pressure. So thinking about how it might be useful for resilience, but also what sort of circumstances where social learning might actually create vulnerability within a population. So from kind of the species that I've studied the most, one of the most useful examples, I think, of vulnerability is in this particular species. So this is a killer whale, or an orca, from the southern resident population in the Pacific Northwest, and this whale has a Chinook salmon in her mouth. And what is interesting about this population is that they have specialized on a particular foraging strategy. So they are really quite committed to doing this particular behavior, this particular foraging strategy. In the same area, there's also other whales that are very focused on feeding on marine mammals, and they won't swap. Those groups will not swap between if you grow up being a marine mammal eater, you will not swap and become a fish eater, and likewise fish eaters will not swap to become marine mammal eaters, even if there is an enormous environmental pressure to do so. So they have what we consider to be really quite conservative culture, certainly in terms of their foraging strategy. You can almost sort of think about it as like Victorian behavior, kind of, just a certain set of rules for engagement and conduct, and that those are the rules that they stick to really rigidly. Now, presumably, evolution has developed this strategy for these apex predators because it's advantageous to do so, and it enables them to be able to focus on particular resources in different environments. It's hard to know specifically what those forces are that have brought that particular behavior around, because for this particular group of killer whales, this specialization has actually made them very vulnerable, and so they are very focused on the Chinook salmon, and the Chinook salmon population itself has started to decline, and as a result, the population of the southern resident killer whales is under a lot of pressure. So that's a very good example, I think, of how particular foraging strategy can actually, particularly if the species is very conservative and less likely to switch to another behavior, that can create an enormous vulnerability. And as a conservation biologist, we need to know about that. In contrast, this is a bottlenose dolphin from Western Australia, and she has a sponge on the end of her mouth here. And she uses that to fossick around in the sandy bottom and also in crevices in order to disturb fish that she couldn't normally get to, including flatfish. So this is, again, this is socially learnt. It is learnt from, it's spread, we believe, mostly from mothers to calves. And these often females get some advantage, we think, perhaps from foraging using this, this sponge basically to protect their mouths as they're foraging in places they can't normally get to. There are other tools that they use, and this is very much is a tool by anybody's definition. The use of the sponge is in, certainly to me, this is a tool use. And there are the same population also, there are some individuals who've learned to use conch shells, which is what this other picture shows, where they will use the conch shell as a trap for fish, and then they will lift the conch shell out of the water and the fish will then fall into their mouth. So this is interesting because you've got, within this particular population in Shark Bay, you've got some dolphins that will use the tools and will use for foraging and some that won't. So it's spread through a part of the population, but not all of it. And Sonia Wilde and colleagues did a really interesting study about, thinking about, well, what is the effect of this particular tool use on this population? And they looked at data from before a marine heat wave in Western Australia to after the marine heat wave. And they were able to determine that overall the marine heat wave had generated problems for the entire ecosystem, really, as I don't know if you experience it yourselves where you are, but certainly in New Zealand, we're getting increasing numbers of marine heat waves coming. Last year we actually had 2 in a row, and they have potential for sort of cascading effects across the entire marine ecosystem. For these dolphins, there was a discernible difference in their survivorship. So the graph on the left-hand side at the bottom there shows survival of the dolphins, and you can see that it declines in both the sponges and the non-sponges. But what was interesting is that for the non-sponges, their rate of decline was significantly different to the rate of decline of the sponges. So it seems that sponging provides what we call it a sort of like cultural buffering. So this knowledge that is shared creates some sort of resilience to this perturbation in the environment, which in this case was marine heat wave. And that is quite strong evidence, I think, for the value of the sharing of this information in order to help survival rates. So we've given kind of an example of how culture can generate vulnerability, but then there's also instances where it can generate resilience. And one other thing to think about as well, I talked earlier about the whooping cranes and how social information or social learning can be used in order to help with reintroduction. Similarly, there's the case study of these small monkeys are golden lion tamarins, and they are a South American species that are quite often, you'll find in captivity, that are being reintroduced to the wild in some cases. Now, there was a really low success rate for their initial reintroductions, and by using various aspects of social learning, teaching them about predators and then provisioning them and providing them with nest sites, these particular primates were able to go from a reintroduction success survival rate of 13% right up to 70%, because the youngsters that were, or the individuals that were released into the wild, were able to survive long enough to socially learn the skills for them to survive better, because they had just enough information and just enough help through provisioning of food and nest sites, that they've had this profound effect on their survivorship. So that's kind of a mixture of sort of human intervention and social learning from the golden lion tamarins. This example is this is a lonely male regent honey eater, beautiful Australian bird, And unfortunately, this species is critically endangered. And what has happened with this particular species is really interesting. So the population density got so low that the males, the young males, as they were developing, were not learning the song of their own species. There were too few individuals, the density of the birds was sufficiently low that the young males were actually learning the song of other birds. And as a result, they were struggling to find females and mate successfully. So this is a case where the lack of social information, the lack of cultural song transmission was actually potentially creating a precipitous decline in an already declining population. So in this instance, we can arguably say that culture is quite important as an indicator for potential extinctions. So as you can see, culture influences populations in all sorts of different ways. And really what this raises is many important questions about how these processes play out across different kinds of ecosystems, across different species, across different anthropogenic threats. So we have a lot of questions about this, and through this group, through the conventional migratory species, we have kind of like teased out some aspects of it, and we think that in many ways you can kind of resolve it down into two key things. One is that culture can maybe be able to help you understand what it is we need to conserve, only in some circumstances though, and also how we do conservation. So in terms of the reintroductions, and maybe in relation to things like how you manage human wildlife conflict. So in relation to what we conserve, we already, we mostly know that we use sort of genetics in order to be able to delineate populations, and through geographic distinction between populations. So we're already kind of using that higher level of differentiation between those units that we want to conserve. And then the question is, what kind of situations might culture actually require us to focus very much on the conservation of a particular population that has a particular cultural variant? The killer whales is a good example of when that is appropriate, but that might not be appropriate right the way across the board. For example, if you look at this DIP, which means demographically independent population, in that particular population, you've got two cultural variants. You've got a green circle and a blue circle. And of course, culture is itself incredibly dynamic. And those circles could be moving in and out of those all those demographically independent populations, and moving across those populations in different circumstances. It will depend upon the information that's being shared, the amount of connectivity between those demographically independent populations, and a host of other factors as well. So this makes understanding when we use culture to help us delineate populations quite complicated. But certainly for instances where you have very conservative culture, and you can quite clearly delineate populations, there is a strong argument to use it for conservation purposes in those cases as well. So I was just going to talk a little bit about some examples of how we can use culture to help us with human wildlife interactions. So social learning can be really useful if you have an undesirable behavior. You can use social learning to try to help a population to learn something that's more desirable, but it's not necessarily easy, and sometimes it can require you to identify key individuals who you can hope to train to behave in a certain way, and those individuals may be more likely for that information to spread across the population. So in the bottom left there, we've got some African elephants that are actually learning about the dangers of beehives. Those yellow boxes are beehives that are being used as sort of to stop the elephants moving into areas where there are crops. So there's been lots of other ways that people have tried to use to stop the elephants getting to the crops, firstly fences, for example, which are quite easily trampled by the elephants if they want to get in there. And researchers have discovered that these beehive fences can actually be much more effective, and particularly if key individuals who are, the sort of the perpetrators of the stealing of the crops learn about those beehive fences. And this is generally considered to be sort of a good solution in an environment where, obviously, as is the case with crop raiding for a variety of different species, often one of the ways to stop animals from crop raiding is to shoot them. So this is a much better solution for those particular elephants. The picture on the bottom right hand side is it looks a bit like, whatever is that? That it is actually a sperm whale in Alaska, very carefully picking off a sablefish, which is hooked onto a long line. Now, this is quite incredible. If you've ever seen sperm whales, they have sort of their lower jaw is offset, quite a long way back from the front of their head. And so the fact that these whales have learnt so dexterously to very gently pick the fish off the hook without getting caught themselves, just with their lower jaw, is quite amazing. And this is a still taken from some footage that was captured some years ago. Researchers have demonstrated that not only can one whale do this, as we see here, but actually this behavior has spread through a group of sperm whales as well. And so again, this is one of the examples where human activity in the wild, and other species are learning from our activities in order to be able to extract resources themselves. At the top here, this is a picture of a cockatoo in a suburb or in eastern Australia, where the cockatoos have learnt to get into the bins in order to be able to, take whatever they want, usually food, out of the bin. And what's quite interesting in this example is that Lucy Aplin and colleagues at Australian National University have developed a study to see how the humans are responding to what the cockatoos are doing. And it's really quite intriguing, because the humans have tried a variety of different methods to try to keep these birds out of the bins, including, the heavy object of the brick, which, as you can see there, the cockatoos knocking the brick right off the top of the bin, to rubber snakes in order to scare them off, to jamming the hinges to try to stop them getting in, and to heavier objects that can't be removed. What's quite remarkable is that the cockatoos seem to find a way around almost everything that the humans are doing in order to stop them getting into the bins. And sometimes, they're kind of like working together in order to flick the bin open. And we kind of refer to this really as a cultural arms race between the human beings and the cockatoos. So through the work on the Convention on Migratory Species, we've come up with sort of a preliminary framework, if you like, about how we might be able to think about conservation in relation to the social learning, or rather the way around, how we can think about social learning in relation to conservation. So the first panel, there's a lot of detail here, but really just sort of thinking about these is, panels 1, 2, and 3. So in the first panel, we have better and increasingly higher resolution ways of identifying social learning in the wild and animal culture. So first of all, we've got to establish, is there animal culture? As I mentioned before, not all behavior is cultural, and there is a temptation sometimes to look at a behavior and sort of say, oh, well, that's, that's culture, that looks like culture to me. But actually we have a bar that you have to get over, which is, can we determine for sure, using some of these scientific methods, whether this really is cultural behavior, or this really is socially learnt within that population, or that it isn't being driven by something in the environment as lots of independent events of individual learning, or whether it's genetically determined. So that's the first sort of hurdle, really, is this idea of how we provide evidence for social learning in kind of a sufficiently scientific way. And then we need to, in panel 2, we're sort of thinking about, well, what does that social learning mean for the conservation of a particular species? It might actually not be very relevant for their conservation. We don't know, but is there good evidence that this particularly socially learned behavior is important to this population's conservation? And if so, how might we either use the processes of social learning to help us do a better job of conservation through reintroductions in human wildlife interactions, or is it significant enough that we need to consider conserving a population based on a particular behavior or not? And there's debate about that, definitely, and it's really very context specific, in my opinion. And then finally is that, what does this mean in terms of policy in relation to domestic legislation, or the kinds of protections that we can enact across international treaties? So really, this work, which has been ongoing for quite a long time, has to a large extent raised some really fundamental questions about these processes, and it's still, we don't have definitive, there's no silver bullet for this, because actually the scenarios are all very individual and they have to be considered on an individual basis. So it raises questions like, should we focus on cultures that create resilience and have adaptive traits, given that we are facing, multiple crises in terms of the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis? That may be a reasonable strategy. Or should we focus on endangered species or small isolated populations that have unique cultures? Should we conserve cultural units within wider populations in order to ensure that the overall vital rates for the wider population is conserved? Or should we really be focusing on vulnerability through specialization, as per the killer whale example? Or should we just be conserving all cultures in the interests of biocultural diversity? Because arguably, culture and social learning is certainly part of phenotypic variation. So we conserve genotypic variation, we conserve genes, and so phenotype is how the genes manifest in the world, really. And so should we not be considering culture as part of the wider biodiversity of our planet? It's another information stream sort of beyond DNA, and maybe that would be, some of these questions might be quite nice to debate after I finish talking. But I think the other thing to consider is that what I've discussed so far are very mechanistic, if you like, ways of thinking about culture and social learning in wild populations. But perhaps there are other aspects to consider. To begin with, I don't think culture should ever be used as a standalone tool. There is, for the conservation of biodiversity, there is a limited amount of time and resources, and certainly the time is decreasing at a very rapid rate. So the idea is really to use culture and social learning to augment what is already going on and to try and make it more efficient and more effective. Culture is certainly phenomenally powerful, actually, as an education and an awareness raising tool. There is something about talking about and understanding that social learning and culture generates, it provides, I think it sort of narrows the gap between ourselves and other species, in the sense of understanding that other species are in some ways discerning about what they do, that they are learning from one another, rather than just being, populations that are just genes that continue to propagate into the future. So I think culture can be really useful in that regard. And we don't know very much about ephemeral cultures. There are some cultures that are really stable, and we don't know the value of ephemeral cultures. There are plenty of ephemeral cultures in our own societies, so cultures that will sort of appear and sort of burn really over a short period of time and then disappear. And this photograph on the left is of a dolphin from a study that I've been involved with in Australia, where this particular dolphin went into captivity because she was being rehabilitated to go back into the wild. When she was in captivity, she didn't ever perform tail walking, but she did observe other dolphins that were in dolphin shows that were tail walking. When she went back to the wild, she didn't tail walk for a number of years, and tail walking had never been seen in this population. And then one day she was observed tail walking, and after some time her tail walking started to spread across the population. And Mike Bosley, who's been studying this population of bottlenose dolphins for probably close to 40 years now, was able to chart this particular behavior as it moved across, as it spread and was culturally transmitted across the population. So, as we know, as far as we know, this is that there's no biological role that we understand from this behavior. It's certainly not been observed in the population beforehand. There are no records that Mike could find of it, prior to his starting to study this population. So we don't think that there's necessarily any biological role, but it might be that there's something associated with tail walking and slamming the surface could have some effect on stunning fish. We don't know. It could be that it's just fun and this is a play behavior. But it also could be that this particular behavior could become some kind of ethnic marker for the group, like this is what we do kind of thing, which is not unlike the example that we see sometimes of a particular group of chimpanzees putting a piece of grass inside their ear, which there sort of seems to be ornamentation. So it might be that it's something like that. But what's interesting is that this behavior started to decline, as you can see, by 2015, and actually now here we are in 2023 and the behavior is not observed anymore. So that was very much an example of kind of a culture that kind of came into being and then disappeared. But one of the questions I have really is about, we're thinking a lot about the extrinsic value of culture in relation to how it might help us do conservation, the kind of role that culture has in evolutionary processes, but also what might culture mean to the individual animals themselves. Does it have intrinsic value to them, potentially even in the same way that our cultures have profound intrinsic value to us? There's really no question that that's the case. We will go to war over our cultures, actually. So that's a very tricky question to answer, but I think it is worth thinking about when we consider the value of culture for wildlife. And then this is sort of one final little thought. Mostly what we think about when we think about culture is we think about its potential evolutionary benefit. And when we think about maladaptive genes, for example, we assume that maladaptive genes are going to be self-limiting. It's in the definition, really, isn't it? But what happens with maladaptive cultures? Do maladaptive cultures arise? And if so, what does that mean for their propagation? So this is maybe a bit of a facetious example, but there is definitely the spread of information which could be potentially bad for our own survival. And this particular example made it into the British Medical Journal, actually. But so former President Trump obviously gave the example of, I'm sure not many people will have forgotten about this, injecting bleach into yourself as a potential solution to the COVID-19 crisis. And that particular behaviour, if that had been uptaken by sufficient numbers of people, that potentially could have affected their survivorship and their ability to go on to reproduce. So whilst I use that as a facetious example, I do so because it's probably the more jolly example that I can give than a lot of, other sort of grimmer examples where human beings have been influenced by socially learned behavior in order to do things that have been detrimental to their own survivorship or their ability to reproduce. And say Jonestown, for example, would be an example of that. This one is a curious one as well. The same sort of suggestion has been made for, this is Rapa Nui. You'd probably know it as Easter Island. And for the population that were living on these islands, this particular island, it is thought by some anthropologists that the development and the effort that was required in order to go into developing these totemic sculptures that are, they are known the world over, but obviously not all the time. But these are interesting and profound things to us. So imagine what they were like for the culture that was actually building and utilizing them. And the concern of the anthropologists is that actually so much effort was put into this cultural behavior that actually it caused the precipitous decline of the population and ultimately for the population to actually completely die out. So was that maladaptive culture in play? Perhaps it was. We don't know. And this is a picture of pilot whales stranded, and pilot whales strand in lots of different parts of the world fairly regularly en masse. That certainly happens in New Zealand every year. In fact, from sort of November onwards, we're kind of on high alert for this exact scenario. And what happens usually is you will have one individual that may have a problem, or it may be a navigation error. It's yet to be determined, but you end up in a situation where you get literally up to hundreds of these pilot whales on the beach. Now, without human intervention and without a lot of luck and a good tide, these whales can often end up dead. So this seems like, again, a maladaptive culture, and that's been suggested by one of my colleagues, Hal Whitehead, that perhaps this is maladaptive culture, but it's confusing because we also know that there is fossil evidence for whales, particularly pilot whales, stranding for thousands of years. So it seems that the populations can sustain this level of social cohesion, which means that actually every now and then a large group of them is taken out and dies and are obviously taken from the population and again can't reproduce. So there's some tension between how maladaptive culture can propagate across a population and what you might think through genes. Maladaptive genes are usually removed from the population through the processes of natural selection, but with culture it's quite a bit more complicated. So in summary, culture is, as we know, really vital for human beings, but it's also vital for non-humans. It can be really important for them to be able to have diverse enough behaviors to be able to adapt to significant changes in their environment. It can create vulnerability or it can create resilience. And we hope to be able to foster those instances where it creates resilience, because many wild populations, if not all wild populations, are going to need all the help they can get in terms of generating resilience in the decades and centuries to come. We know that culture creates patterning in the world environment. We have better tools for measuring that now, and it can also be important for helping us to understand how to delineate populations. One thing that we are quite focused on through CMS is this idea of generating or protecting cultural capacity across populations. And then the question is, how do we do that? Is it as simple as necessarily just maintaining the integrity of habitats, or behavioral diversity across populations. So this is something that we need to work to put more parameters around exactly how we maintain cultural capacity. But my final bid really is to say that I do strongly believe that culture itself is important to other species, and that we really need to consider it as part of our wider understanding of what biodiversity is. And with that, I will just say thank you to all of the amazing people whose work I've represented and who I've worked with over the last 10, 20 years. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Philippa. Fascinating. Really interesting. I put far too many questions in the chat box, but I hope there are a few other questions as well. Perhaps in the break you can have you can go and do whatever you need to do, or you can have a look at the questions and have a think about them. But I suggest, let me have a look. It's now 8 minutes to 9 in the evening in Great Britain. So let's say we'll come back about 3 minutes to 9. Yeah, 5 minutes. I think that's just enough to grab a cup of tea or something. But that's brilliant. Thank you very much. And,
you're very welcome.
And don't run away, anybody. Let's see you after the break, because the questions and answers can be absolutely fascinating. Thank you very much. See you in a couple of minutes. See ya.
See you shortly.
David, can you hear me?
No. Yes, I can. Hello.
How do you get rid of the strip of faces on the right so you can see the photographs that have been put up?
The strip of faces?
Yes.
You should be able to see the photos as well.
Yeah, but only half of them sticking out.
Oh, I
Can't get
don't
rid of
know.
them.
I wasn't having that problem. I could see the slideshow as well. So I don't know. I can't help you there. But anyway, I know. I'm sure you've got some questions, Christina. So perhaps you can put them in the chat box.
And David, can I just ask how long this goes after the break?
We'll finish in just over half an hour.
Okay.
Are you all right for it? I know it's the middle of your working day, but
it is. I might have to sign off and sign back on.
Okay, that's fine, Julie.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. Hope to see you a bit later. Okay.
Yeah, I'll be back.
Cheers. Bye. Well, I'm back. I don't know who else is back, but so Philippa, have you had a chance to look at the chat box and see?
I have. There's some great questions here. I can tell that people were listening very intently. I'm really impressed. Great question. So shall I just go through them in order? Shall we do it that way?
Sure.
So the first one is
Philippa, can I just say one thing? If anyone's asked a question, or if anyone wants to ask a supplementary question, do just unmute and speak up. Don't be shy about doing that. I think that's fine. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
So the first one is there any evidence of social learning between different species? And yes, there is. I've been trying to think about what the example is, and I recall that during one of our workshops, one of the experts was talking about this, and I have a feeling it was between bird species, actually. There are cross-fostering experiments, which I'll talk about a bit later and reply to one of the questions. But yes, I think there is. Difficult to think of an example off the top of my head, but yeah, there definitely is examples. And I mean, social learning has lots of different ways of, there's lots of different types of social learning. So you can have sort of the spread of information through local enhancement, we call it. So basically, when you see some grain or some birdseed put down on the ground and 1 or 2 sparrows turn up, and then all of a sudden there are 50 sparrows there, that's essentially local enhancement, because they're learning from the others that that's a food source. So that's kind of like the lower end of social learning processes, right up to emulation to teaching. There are examples of where, for example, the photograph of the meerkats and the montage slide at the beginning is a really interesting example. It's an experiment which Alex Thornton at Exeter University has been involved with, where they were able to show that the female, actually I'm not sure it's the females or the males, but certainly the adults provision young meerkat kits with scorpions for them to eat, but because the scorpion is very dangerous to handle, they actually break off the tail of the scorpion first, and then they provision them so that they learn to handle the scorpion and its pincers before they have to learn to deal with its sting. So that's one of the really rare examples that we have of evidence for teaching in the wild, but I suspect that teaching in the wild actually happens quite a lot. Teaching is quite a high bar in terms of scientific evidence, but I imagine that it probably occurs more than we realize. I don't know the example of worm charming in birds, but it sounds fascinating, and I'd love for somebody to tell me about it. So,
well, I'll butt in, but the other person who asked it Stephen might want to butt in as well. But certainly here in Tinmouth, which is by the sea, you see the seagulls. Any bit of, that's right, Christina's showing you, any bit of grass there is, you'll see the seagulls pounding the earth like this. They're doing a nice little dance. It's ever so funny to watch.
wow.
Apparently that brings the worms up. I've heard that it's because it sounds like rain coming down the ground, and they like getting wet and the moist ground. Is that what you were referring to, Stephen? I imagine.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So yeah. I'm wondering why a seabird would know to charm worms off the ground on land.
But I've also seen blackbirds doing it, and I remember seeing blackbirds doing that when I was a kid, and I don't remember seeing seagulls doing it when I was a kid. And I spent the first 6 years of my life in Dover, so there were plenty of seagulls around there. But I don't know. I'm just wondering if the blackbirds did it first and the seagulls copied it off them. But that's just speculation. I don't know.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and the way to determine it, of course, would be to sort of study the population and identify individuals, and then see if it is spreading, through social learning across the population. But certainly that could be an example where a particular behaviour was, cross species learned. I've got a sort of a small study here going on with a behaviour where blackback gulls will pick up these pippy shells, which are bivalve mollusks. and they'll fly up really, really high in the air, and then they'll drop them on the beach, kind of in between the dry sand and the really wet sand, where the sand is hardest, and it bursts the shell open, and then they'll feed on them. But what's interesting in that case is that silver gulls come and scrounge off them as well, so they will hang out with them. So there's definitely observation between species, you know, because ultimately it's about survival, isn't it, and trying to get enough food. So yeah, I think that's a really interesting example.
What is funny is that, I mean, we see that on Teignmouth Promenade a lot. The other Timovians will agree with me that the promenade could be quite covered with broken shells from all the seashells they've been dropping. But I've observed quite often the younger ones, the herring gulls, which are a different colour, they're still grey. They're dropping them, but they're not dropping. They'll drop them on a bit of grass or on a bit of wet sand, and then look very puzzled when they don't break open. So it seems to take a while to learn to drop them on something hard. I don't know if any other locals want to disagree with me on that. But that certainly seems to be evidence of social learning, I'd say.
Yeah, interesting.
I've also seen seagulls doing this padding behaviour just at the water margin on the beach, as if they're trying to get something to come up through the sand.
In the parks, on the road verges, they can be quite a long way from the sea itself, quite a long way inland. I see it a lot. See it right next to Lidl in Teignmouth. Last verge, and there's a pair of them who do it a lot there.
So I've noticed with the blackbacks that drop the pippy shells here that they will. This hasn't happened for quite a number of years, but at one point there was at least one individual who was obviously trying out a different surface and would fly across the road and drop it on the roofs of people's houses, because presumably that was a harder surface, occasionally on the road, but sometimes on the roof, because presumably there's maybe less effort involved for getting the shell broken open, and maybe you could break larger shells, I don't know. So yeah, I think there's a degree of trying different things out. I mean, the idea that we have is we sort of think about populations as there being an innovator. They do something new and then everyone else copies it. But I think in reality, what probably happens is, you know, all of the time, you know, there are various innovators trying stuff that doesn't work, and then when something does work, it gets copied. So should we look at the next question? So what do you think about the group of killer whales that's been biting the rudders off boats? What's their goal? Yes, I wish I could answer that question. So one thing that I do know, so Ruth Esteban has been leading some research on this particular population for quite a long time. Something I have heard is that there was an incidence of, so we think it probably is socially learned. We don't have sufficient evidence yet to be sure. It certainly seems to be socially learnt within that individual pod, but it might actually be moving between pods now as well, and that's the curious thing, because there was one instance recorded in one place, and then a day later, 800 kilometers away, there was another instance. And whilst killer whales can swim a very long way, they can't swim 800 kilometers in 24 hours. So we think that this might possibly be spreading across the population. What's their goal is such an interesting question, because to me, I don't know if you've ever been in a boat with killer whales, but you know, these are very large predators. You know, they are absolutely, they're you know, that people do refer to them as tigers of the sea, but I think they're very different to that actually. But a male killer whale will have a dorsal fin that is 3 meters tall. Not 3 meters. They are huge, heavy animals. I think if they wanted to tip those boats over and there was a group of them, they absolutely could do it. If you've ever seen the pictures and the footage from the Antarctic of 3 whales or 2 or 3 whales creating a bow wave to knock over a small ice floe that's got a seal on it. This is one of their foraging strategies down in the Antarctic. So they can definitely coordinate to do things. So I feel that if they really wanted to try to get to the humans, they would probably be generating bow waves. They would try to be rocking the boat. The fact that their behavior is so targeted on the rudders, I find really fascinating, because I wonder if part of it is the excitement of getting a rise. You know, they're getting noise and response from the human beings. I don't know. I really don't know what their goal is, but I do worry for them, because I think that they may just be having fun, and the result of that may well end up being that some of them will get shot, and I think that would be a real tragedy. So yeah, it's a good question, but I really don't know the answer, sadly. What have we got next? What would it be possible to teach the bird species shown their song by playing them recordings? Yes, it absolutely would. That's a really, really good question. So that's about the regent honeyeater. And in actual fact, that is exactly what is happening at the moment in captivity. One of the researchers who's been studying this population in the wild is trying to do exactly that, and it's sort of will be one of our first examples of what, you know, we think of as cultural rescue, that you provide them the song in the hope that they can then go back out into the wild and propagate and make more little male birds that sing the right song. So yeah, that's exactly how we hope that it can be utilized.
But would they recognize it as their song? Would there be some intuitive understanding if you played them two different songs, or songs of completely different species and their own species? Would they preferentially learn their own? Do you know, or has that not been tried?
Well, so it's obviously true of the females in the wild, isn't it? Because they're preferentially choosing the males that sing those songs. But when you've already learned a song, can you learn a new song? I don't know the answer to that. I suspect maybe not, actually, but song does evolve, so perhaps it is possible. Like the examples of song evolution in birds and also in humpback whales, for example, is quite remarkable. You can see colleague Ellen Garland has shown how whale song propagates, right across the Pacific Islands. The song actually, moves across the islands, and then it can change, and so it's always evolving. So I don't know, but it is possible that they could relearn a new song, but I think the idea in captivity would probably be to rear young that just hear their own song, so that's the song that they learn. Is it ever possible to transfer individuals from one population that are developed a behavior useful for survival to another struggling population to the same species that hasn't developed that behavior? And I think yes is the answer. There are, for example, cross-fostering experiments in birds where you will put youngsters. This is really to sort of determine whether behavior is socially learnt or not. But actually, I'm just trying to think of examples. Well, actually, the golden line tamarin example is the same species, but it's so where the introduced population, you could imagine, was sort of from a different, from a captive population. They're going into a population where there are wild individuals who are already demonstrators, if you like, because they are surviving. So that would be an example of that. The tamarins are learning from experienced individuals who kind of know how to survive in the wild. So that definitely does happen. But I think utilizing that process in the future more will help us be more successful with reintroductions. In terms of like lifting an individual who's successful in a different environment and then sort of inserting them into a new environment where others are struggling to survive, I don't know whether that would work. And I guess culture is usually quite well adapted to specific, there are environmental forces that are helping to shape culture. Originally, we used to think about, in order to demonstrate social learning in culture, we used to suggest that this sort of exclusionary process whereby you rule out genetic causation and you rule out any kind of ecological causation. If you can rule both of those out, then you can say, well, then it must be socially learned. But in reality, as we know from our own species, genes and culture co-evolve. You know, these processes are intertwined with one another. So yeah. And the tail walking is kind of a cool example. It was a nice accidental wild experiment, really. The tail walking.
Was it a female? Did you say it was a female?
Yeah.
So it wasn't. It wouldn't have been a sort of sexual display thing. It wouldn't be a showing off. Look how fit I am, or would it?
Yeah, we don't know. Good question. I mean, we tend to usually think of sexual displays being male orientated, but it might be. We really don't know. The fact that it spread, and it spread sort of vertically and obliquely, actually, you know, from not directly from mothers, but also sort of from related like aunts. So yeah, it was. We don't know. If only we could interview some of these species.
We'll get there one day.
Yeah. Somebody answered bee dancing, which is exactly right. That's a really good example of social learning in insects. And it's quite a phenomenal thing, you know, because they're giving you know, directed information, very specific directed information, generating, you know, a bearing from the bee's body and the sun in order for where the rest of the hive needs to fly, and it seems to be really effective, certainly for their survival.
But the dance itself is instinctive. So they don't learn how to do the dance from others, presumably.
I believe so. I believe the dance is instinctive, but the others are learning. It's social information that's being transmitted about where to go, which is why then all of the bees go in the same direction, because they've learnt where they need to go. Yeah, but that's more, it's just on the cusp, really, to my mind. That's social information rather, you know, that they're all using together. Somebody's asked, what about lemmings for maladaptive culture? Yes. Absolutely. Yeah, good point. It would seem that almost all human contact with other species leads to maladaptive culture for that species. Tigers, elephants, as you showed, herring gull diet is now fast food. Yeah, it does feel a bit that way, doesn't it? But, you know, my hope is that one can get very anxious about the trajectory of new technologies and AI and what that will mean for our own species and for all of biodiversity. But my hope is that using logic, we might actually be able to generate a slightly more just society and slightly more egalitarian way of interacting with the wild, and kind of really help us to, we know the value. You know, there aren't many human beings that you can have a conversation with who genuinely don't think that nature has any value. So we do know the value of nature, but it's quite difficult with our modern cultures to prioritize it. So if we can use some of this understanding to help us to prioritize nature and understand how we are all really very strongly cultural beings, that we are so shaped by the things that we learn from each other and the social forces around us, that might help us a little bit to get over ourselves and protect nature a bit better, I hope. I heard that the group of killer whales where their mum taught her kids, sorry, I can't see that because that's gone. What's happened? I heard of a group of killer whales where the mum taught her kids her special way of sneaking up onto the shore to snatch seals. Well, I mean, that certainly happens in Patagonia, and that, again, that's socially learned behavior. And similarly, so they will sneak up onto the shore. The famous pictures of the whales virtually beaching themselves, very risky behavior, but it's clearly worth it for the snacks that they get there. And similarly, they will also take, I'm trying to think what bird species it is, but it's in a similar sort of situation with the killing of birds. Yeah, somebody said this is so cool about the songs evolving. Yeah, it really is. I mean, there's a great example actually of the humpback whale song, and of course, humpback whale song was one of the very earliest evidence we had for culture in other species. Some of the earliest evidence. There's an interesting example where there was like a song revolution, where humpback whales around Australia, sort of on the east coast and across the Pacific, they're singing one song, and on the west coast they were recorded singing another song. And then I'm trying to think which way round it was. I think it was that whale, certainly the song that was heard on the west coast was then recorded on the east coast, and it totally, in one season, it generated sort of a revolution in the song that was happening that year. So it was, the people who studied it described it as, it's like the Beatles turning up in America, and all of a sudden this particular song took off. So yeah, really amazing. Is there evidence of animal learning through language? That is a tricky question to answer. I'm not sure I'd be the best person to answer it, but I think the problem is that the threshold for saying that there's language in other species we haven't necessarily met yet in pretty much any species. However, there are examples of apes in captivity, great apes in captivity, that have learned sign language. So, and I always find that really interesting, even just, I live with a dog, and I find it really interesting how quickly he learnt from me what my vocalizations meant, in comparison to how many more years it's taken for me to understand what his vocalizations mean. Yeah. We were camping once and heard a bird singing Match of the Day theme tune. Are you sure? That's brilliant. That seems like a great place to end. Yeah.
Oh, I did have another question. It's gone out of my head. Don't go yet. Oh no, what was it? Oh no, I can't remember. That's put me off. Any more questions? Anybody? You could just unmute and ask a question if you've got something else you'd like to ask. Or is there something that Philippa, that you thought, oh no, I should have said this?
Mm-hmm. One thing I'd like to say, just reflecting what Philippa said early on, is that this sort of understanding of animal culture that serves to narrow the gap between humans and animals in our perceptions. That they're seen to be less automatic and instinct driven, that they do have sort of what you might describe as sort of higher systems of behavior control,
Learning behavior,
work as well.
Actually, Michael, what you said has reminded me what my question was, which is I spend way too much time watching Instagram videos of animals doing amazing things, interacting with humans, and there's been quite a few of animals copying human behavior, like especially humans doing workouts, yoga and stuff, and you see cats or dogs copying very exactly what the humans are doing. Now, of course, the humans might have trained the animals to do this, but it's quite hard to train a cat. And it does look like they're kind of, it's not like they're doing it because they want to. That generated a question myself, more generally, as to whether there are any behaviorists actually studying social media videos of animals, because there is some extraordinary behavior.
Yeah, I'm certain there are, actually. I'm quite certain there are, because it is a great source of data, isn't it? Sort of a massive citizen science project. I mean, I guess maybe now is the window to do it, because in another year's time there'll be plenty of fake stuff, even more fake stuff, I imagine. So yeah, I think the way I look at it as well is that copying, it has massive evolutionary benefit, usually, unless it's maladaptive culture, which is why there is such a thing as maladaptive culture, because we are so hardwired for copying. So it makes sense to me that if, you know, particularly for pets, because we become their conspecifics, even though we're not the same species. You know what I mean? It's sort of as far as they're concerned, we are their pack or their tribe or whatever. So copying us makes a lot of sense, really.
I had a cute
add to that?
example.
Joanna.
On Armistice Day in Teignmouth, we have a 2-minute silence on Armistice Day, and it was outdoors in the square in the middle of Teignmouth. Quite a number of people had dogs with them, and the dogs were a little bit disruptive during some of it. But when the 2-minute silence started, all the dogs sat down and were completely quiet, because they totally picked up from the fact that all the humans were silent. It was really sweet and quite moving to just look down and see these quiet dogs just waiting for the 2-minute silence to end. And they won't have practiced that. They just did it because we did it.
Yeah, isn't that fascinating? And that's one of the, yeah, that's amazing, because also that's the thing I've noticed about our dog, is that he will he's watching us with such focus. You know, they're picking up on things that, you know, obviously the sensory things that we have no understanding of, because we don't have that range of, you know, his sense of smell. He knows what I had for breakfast yesterday, I imagine, you know. So I find it really fascinating, the degree of focus on behavior. But that's such a great example of that sort of unspoken communication, and I do feel that is really strong in dogs. I feel that, well, yes, they bark and they vocalize, but actually there's a lot of other posturing and behavioral cues that they are picking up on.
We had earlier this year, I don't know if you were there, Joanna, we had an in-person science cafe from a representative of a charity called Medical Detection Dogs. And they train dogs to work with people who have particular conditions, who the dogs learn to pick up signals, not just from smell, but from behavior. If that person is going to have a crisis in the next few minutes, and the dog will warn the human, saying, you need to go somewhere safe because you're going to have, you know, you're going to have a seizure or something.
I think it was epilepsy was the example. Yeah.
Well, I thought they didn't train it for epilepsy. I thought it was almost.
Oh, was it other seizure conditions? Yeah, maybe. Sorry.
But it was an incredibly moving science cafe. There was a bit of video at the end, but we were all in tears at talking about the difference it had made to her life, where she'd been trapped in that house, and now she had this dog who would look out for her and warn her if she needed to find somewhere safe. So I mean, you're absolutely right that dogs are, you know, they've had 40,000 years of co-evolution with us, and boy, is that sensitive to what we need and what we're doing.
Yeah, exactly. And it's quite difficult, isn't it? I think, because, you know, the modern world is very fast, and we live in our own brains a lot. So putting ourselves in the minds of others who have totally different sensory perceptions to us is quite tricky.
Okay, well, I should probably let you go and get on with your day. It was actually really hard for Philippa, but that was absolutely fascinating. And I can give everyone a moment to unmute.
I'm going to just do that.
And
that's not making it any easier.
And let's show our appreciation of Philippa's wonderful talk and answers to her questions in the traditional manner. So thank you, Philippa.
Oh no, thank you.
That's absolutely brilliant.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Can I just take a moment to say, if anybody wants to go on the choir email list, so that I can let you know. I mean, mainly we do in-person talks here in Teignmouth, but I am trying to keep the the online science cafes going as well. We started during the pandemic, and it's nice to give people all around the world the opportunity to join in. So I'm just going to put my email address, my personal email address, it's simple, into the chat box, buzzjig@gmail.com. Oh no, I've sent it to Dominic only. That's no good, is it? Hang on. everyone, I think Dominic knows it already. That's gmail.com. There we go. Yeah, so drop me a line if you want to go on the email. I'll let you know all the things. So, but thank you, Philippa. Thank you. That was brilliant. Really fascinating.
Oh no, it's my pleasure. Thank you for taking an interest and staying up, and wishing you all a peaceful, restful break at some point in December.
Yeah. All right. Thanks everybody for coming along.
Thank
Lovely to see
you.
you.
Thanks, David.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Bye,
Thank you,
everybody.
David.
Bye. Bye. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
We don't have to boil it or anything.